Every NFL team has this one player who not only played lights out during his career, but also established himself as the best player all time within this team. So, today we're taking a look at the best player of the Super Bowl era in each of the 32 NFL teams. If you end up liking this video and don't want to miss out on the next one, please consider subscribing. It's free and it really helps a lot. Anyways, we're starting with the easiest pick of this list, the one and only Tom Brady. The Patriots have had great players in their history, but being arguably the best one in all football, Brady is a no-brainer here. Anyways, a much tougher pick was Jerry Rice for the 49ers. Having played in the same team as some NFL legends like Joe Montana is tough if you want to stand out. However, being a legend himself, Jerry Rice did just that, and for me, he's the best player to ever play for the San Francisco 49ers. Another tough pick was the one for the Packers in BART STARR. The Green Bay Holy Trinity consisting of him, Brett Favre, and Aaron Rodgers definitely made this pick one to spend some time on. However, both Favre and Rodgers have one Super Bowl title to their name, while STARR has two despite playing for considerably less time during the Super Bowl era. Speaking of Super Bowls, Thurman Thomas comes up next, who played in 4 Super Bowls yet couldn't win a single one. Regardless, he was one of the biggest stars in that Buffalo offense, and he's a certified Bills legend. Another legend in this list is JOE GREENE for the Steelers. The multiple times All-Pro and 2 times Defensive Player of the Year was one of the key pieces of the Pittsburgh Steelers 70s dynasty. Moving on with the Texans is JJ WATT. The oldest brother in the Watt family made a name for himself in Houston as he showed to be the best player in the team's history and arguably one of the greatest defenders of all time. And speaking of the greatest players of all time, we now have Walter Payton. The NFL's 1997 MVP played his entire career in Chicago, and his stats suggest he's one of the greatest running backs this sport has ever had. There are just a few like him. One of them, Cowboys legend EMMITT Smith. He had 11 consecutive seasons with about 1,000 yards rushing, and by winning MVP in 1993, he established himself as one of the best in the business. Some people might say he's the best running back of all time, but one that's coming up later may just be him, we'll see. Anyways, we now have the Saints with BREES. After a lousy start to his career in San Diego, BREES was able to place himself among the greatest players of all time by joining the Saints and leading them to their first and only Super Bowl victory. He was one of the longest tenured players in the NFL until he retired in 2020. Some say he deserved better, but that's just how the game is. Sticking with quarterbacks, Steve McNair comes up next. It may be a hot take, but Steve McNair is in my opinion one of the most underrated players of all time. The 2003 MVP, who won it alongside Peyton Manning, led his team to its only Super Bowl appearance, and well, how things turned out certainly had an effect on how much recognition McNair got for his game. It's time for some defense now as we continue with Ravens legend Ray Lewis. The 2 times Defensive Player of the Year played his whole career in Baltimore and was a major piece in the team's 2001 Super Bowl campaign. Speaking of Super Bowls, we now have Larry FITZGERALD, who somehow could never get a ring in his long career. There's a famous stat which says he has more tackles than dropped passes. Regardless on how reliable the drop count is, that just shows how amazing and reliable FITZGERALD was in his prime. Moving on, we have John Elway for the Broncos. He spent his entire 15-year career with the Broncos and led them to back-to-back Super Bowls in his last 2 seasons. He's one of the greatest quarterbacks the NFL has ever had. But why not Peyton Manning for Denver? Well, that's because he played most of his career in Indy. So it's Peyton for the Colts. The 5 times MVP had an amazing career with the Colts, and he could have made a case as the best player of all time, but he didn't play as long as he needed in order to do so. And actually, one player in a very similar situation is Barry Sanders. The Lions legend never got a chance to win the Super Bowl, but he definitely established himself as a top 3 running back all time, easily. Some might say he's the best one ever, but his short career doesn't really help. I think he's the best, but one could make a case to say otherwise. Sticking with running backs, LADAINIAN Tomlinson comes up next. The Chargers found a stud in him as he's not only one of the few running backs to ever win MVP, but also he has some of the most insane stats a player could ever wish for. Switching up the defense, now comes JOE GREENE for Washington. He played his entire 19-year career with the Redskins, and his 54 interceptions and 6 touchdowns make him the best player in the franchise history. Simply put, he was a beast. But another top-tier defender, Deion Sanders. He played in 5 teams during his career, but I ultimately picked him for the Falcons as he had some of his best seasons there, and he played 5 years in Atlanta. He's known as one of the best defenders all time, and honestly, I wouldn't challenge that assumption. Moving on, we have a star wide receiver in Chad Johnson. The Bengals legend surpassed 10,000 yards during his time in Cincinnati and managed to get into 5 consecutive Pro Bowls, back when they were a relevant stat. Anyways, we're sticking with wide receivers as we move on to Tim Brown. He played 16 years with the Raiders as he was selected to 9 Pro Bowls and established himself as easily the best wide receiver in the team's history. Moving on to the Buccaneers is Warren Sapp. I'm not picking Brady here since he's only played a couple of seasons there, while Sapp played in Tampa for his first 8 seasons, being named first team All-Pro in half of those. He also won a Defensive Player of the Year award and was overall a great defender during his prime. For the Chiefs comes up the first and only tight end of this list in Tony Gonzalez. Regardless if he is or not the best TE of all time, he definitely changed the perspective of that position, and his 14 Pro Bowl selections definitely back that up, as well as his insane stats. We now head over to Jacksonville with Jimmy Smith. He's the best wide receiver to ever play for the Jaguars, and his 3 All-Pro selections definitely help his case as the best player to ever form part of the Jaguars organization. Then we have Clay Matthews Jr. for the Cleveland Browns. There are not a lot of big names when it comes to this team during the Super Bowl era. However, Matthews stands out as he consistently made plays during his prime back in the 80s. But wait, it's time to name a current player, isn't it? Well, here comes Aaron Donald for the Rams. Despite his career not being over yet, Donald pretty much has the edge over every defender in the organization all time. Donald is also a lock to get into the Hall of Fame once he decides to call it quits. Coming up next is Steve Smith, sir. He played most of his career in Carolina, so that explains why he's the Panthers' all-time receiving yards leader. He had multiple 1,000-yard seasons throughout his career, and despite not being usually named among the greatest wide receivers of all time, he does deserve some recognition. Curtis Martin is the next one up. He played for the Patriots for 3 years, and then his career really got off with the New York Jets. I don't know about y'all, but I think he's also one of the most underrated players ever. He got 100 total touchdowns in his 11-year career, while also being 4th all-time in rushing yards. We now have a quarterback in Dan Marino. He played his entire career over in Miami, where he was selected to 9 Pro Bowls, and of course, he's now a Hall of Famer. The only downside to Marino's career is that he never got to win a Super Bowl, but doing that is more of a team stat, as Russell Wilson is proving this year. Just joking, Wilson is still in my opinion the best thing that could have happened to the Seattle Seahawks. He was the steal of the draft back in 2012, and he led his team to its most recent 2 Super Bowl appearances while dominating the first one. Wilson is having a tough time in Denver, but don't let the recency bias discredit what he did for the Seahawks. Now for the Eagles is Reggie White. He was selected to the Pro Bowl during 13 consecutive seasons and was named Defensive Player of the Year twice. He was constantly selected to the All-Pro team, and he ended his career with the 2nd most sacks of all time. Another top-tier defender is Lawrence Taylor, who played his whole career with the New York Giants. He's one of the few defenders in the league to have won MVP, and his stats suggest he's one of the best defenders the league has ever seen. No doubt he's the best player in the Giants' history. And now it's time for our last player, Randy Moss. Despite only playing 7 years in Minnesota, he had an incredible impact and set some crazy records. I would have said they were unbeatable had Justin Jefferson not beaten them. Why not him then? Well, he's not there yet, and Moss was a beast back in the early 2000s. So much, he's now considered as a top 5 receiver all time. If you enjoyed this video, consider subscribing since it's free and it really helps a lot. If you also want to keep watching my other content, here's one video I think you could like. Anyways, thanks for watching and I'll catch you on the next one.